To get started now. Can everyone hear me okay? AV system working all right? All right. My name is Brad Lale. I am a board member for the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and it's my pleasure today to moderate this session on the future of rail and its changes. We're lucky and honored to have three distinguished panelists. Now, one I think is running just a little late, but they plan on joining us. So I just want to, before we really get into it, you know how if you're at the general session, they reminded you 3 or 4 times about downloading the app. So you've got the app and the schedule and all that. So if you need any help doing that, raise your hand. We'll get somebody over there that can show you how to download the app. And that's the Crowd Compass app. On that app, if you click on our session, you'll find a poll question. And if you'll take a minute to navigate to that section and maybe answer the poll question, we'll see what the results are. Okay. Well, pick one, and then we'll go from there. All right. All right. So it is my pleasure today to introduce to you our first presenter and panelist, Mr. Mr Bose, who is the administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration. Previously, Mr. Bose worked at HNTB. He served as board chair for the Coalition of the Northeast Corridor and on the New Jersey Restart and Recovery Advisory Council. He's also been deputy administrator at FRA, chief counsel, senior advisor, and director of governmental affairs. So he's got a really strong background, as you can tell. So join me in welcoming Mr. Bose to the podium.
Let me see here. All right, there we go. All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Mr. Lale, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you in North Carolina today. I've had the good fortune of the secretary doing the reconnaissance out here for me when he visited back in April in conjunction with Amtrak's 50th anniversary. I wasn't with him that day because I happened to be with the president in Philadelphia, where the president was celebrating that milestone. I'd like to thank the North Carolina Department of Transportation and North Carolina DOT Secretary Boyett for inviting me, and each of you for joining me for this afternoon session. I'm glad to be alongside Ray and John as well. I know Ray actually is an Amtrak board matter that he's presenting at, where I would be if I weren't here. So a lot of things running together today. One thing that I think you all should note is that this is actually my first event as administrator. I was confirmed a week ago, so it's very fitting for me to be with you today and to be in North Carolina State that's very rich in its rail accomplishments and its rail future. At this year's summit, I'm honored to talk about how the Federal Railroad Administration is thinking about the future of rail in America, what it looks like, and how we might work together to advance rail safety, performance, resiliency, and efficiency. For too long, rail has been overlooked in the nation's multimodal transportation network. Not every part of the country is like North Carolina, where rail is well integrated into the transportation system, unfortunately. In some ways, it's the forgotten mode, perhaps because much of it is privately owned. While rail is indispensable in moving people and freight, for decades it's lacked in dedicated and sustained federal funding that's on par with how we care for and invest in our highways and airports. However, before I go further, despite that previous lack of federal commitment, I want to commend North Carolina and the North Carolina Department of Transportation for your proactive and forward-thinking approach to rail investments, both passenger and freight. The state really is and has been a leader in rail innovation and safety for decades. It bears repeating, rail connects people and communities, moves goods, helps address climate change, creates well-paying jobs, and drives economic growth both locally and for our national economy. Without question, the bipartisan infrastructure law is a historic investment in our nation's infrastructure and competitiveness. I want to thank the members of your congressional delegation who supported that legislation. I also want to thank your senators for supporting my confirmation last week. We regularly also work with Chairman Price on a variety of rail issues. It is the bipartisan infrastructure law is an unprecedented opportunity for states and communities to have federal investment leverage their own investment to advance their rail networks further. The result will be more transportation choices for individuals and families, more economic development for communities, along with less traffic congestion, fuel consumption, pollution, and carbon emissions. The law includes $66 billion in rail investments for the next 5 years. That's dedicated investment for the next 5 years, not subject to annual appropriations, which is a big deal in Washington, D.C. speak. It also includes $36 billion in additional authorized funding over the next 5 years. These never-before-seen funding commitments include $44 billion for the FRA's competitive discretionary grant programs over 5 years, and $22 billion to Amtrak in directed grants over 5 years, which includes $6 billion for the Northeast Corridor and $16 billion for its national network. Of the $44 billion dedicated to the Federal Railroad Administration's grant programs, $36 billion over 5 years will go to the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail program. $5 billion over 5 years will go to the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program. And $3 billion over 5 years will go to a new program that is focused on eliminating railroad crossings. These grant programs most likely sound familiar to many of you. That's because North Carolina's done well in them historically already. FRA has a long history of partnering with NCDOT to invest in rail in North Carolina, including almost $1 billion across 30 projects since 2010. That's $1 billion in federal funding that's come North Carolina's way since 2010 for 30 projects. That includes $600 million in completed projects, with most sizable being the Piedmont program between Raleigh and Charlotte. And also, not too far from here, the construction of the Raleigh Union Station. Also notable are grants for essential upgrades to multiple short-line railroads across the state. $100 million is for projects that are currently underway, including the Charlotte Gateway Station, planning for a new bridge crossing over the Cape Fear River in Wilmington, and acquisition of the CSX S-Line to prepare for the Southeast Corridor between Raleigh and Richmond. $240 million remains for projects that are under development, covering a range of improvements from highway rail grade crossing separations to intermodal capacity upgrades between Charlotte and the Port of Wilmington, a new rail station in Lexington, and a new fleet of equipment for use on the Piedmont service. The bipartisan infrastructure law grows many of FRA's grant programs to support projects like the ones I just mentioned. It also creates new funding opportunities to improve safety, performance, resiliency, and efficiency. The new programs include the Corridor Identification and Development Program that identifies new intercity passenger rail corridors, develops the necessary service planning elements, and creates a non-Northeast Corridor project pipeline for associated capital projects. The Railroad Crossing Elimination Program that I mentioned increases grade crossing safety on the Northeast Corridor and across the country and eliminates high-risk crossings that are well known to the communities in which they are located. The Interstate Rail Compacts Program advances systems planning while studying the impacts of systems planning on freight rail operations and ridership. At the FRA, we're working with our modal partners across the Department of Transportation, also known as the operating administrations, and colleagues at the White House to ensure these investments accelerate action, fixing what we have now while laying the foundation to reimagine and transform our rail network for the future. One transformative project under construction is the Charlotte Gateway Station, which many of you may already know about. We began that effort with a planning grant that the federal government gave to the city of Charlotte through the 2014 Tiger program, then advanced for construction with an additional $30 million from the 2015 Tiger program. It shows how projects progress through the pipeline. Construction of the rail elements of the station will be completed later this year, with a multimodal transportation station to follow as a part of transit-oriented development plan for the west side of uptown Charlotte. The Department of Transportation is proud to support work like this, and we're gearing up to get to work on even more projects thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're prioritizing safety, economic growth, climate, and equity. We're conducting a disadvantaged business enterprise study right now to determine whether FRA needs a disadvantaged business enterprise program that already exists at the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Transit Administration, and the Federal Aviation Administration. We need our programs to benefit as many businesses as possible. As we move forward with implementation, we're deeply committed to working together, strengthening partnerships with states and state DOTs, local governments, industry, and others to ensure we seize this moment to build a more inclusive and responsive grant program process that stands the test of time. Right now, FRA is listening to our stakeholders, like North Carolina, about what has and what has not worked previously, what has been difficult with our grant process, and where we might make improvements within our guidelines as Congress allows. Beyond these listening sessions that we'll do, we're about to begin educational webinars in the coming months to help potential grantees understand the requirements and process of applying to our competitive discretionary grant programs. We're focused on creating a sustainable rail program that further connects people, communities, and markets for generations to come. Building that pipeline will be essential. We're focused on creating that pipeline of rail projects and corridors. This is only achieved with consistent engagement, a commitment to strong collaboration, and a true ongoing partnership. I hope this approach is one that many of you can relate to. I know North Carolina DOT also emphasizes public outreach and stakeholder engagement to identify and advance projects on a consistent basis. Whether it be the partnership between the state and CSX on the Carolina Connector Intermodal Terminal at Rocky Mount, or the City of Raleigh and host railroads on Raleigh Union Station, it takes a commitment to collaborate and share a common understanding to deliver projects responsive to community needs. Investing in rail can be a win-win. Both freight and passenger rail can coexist and benefit from each other. whether through improved track or structures or better performance. With so many opportunities before us, I'm mindful of the resiliency demonstrated by the railroad industry during the pandemic. This includes continued efforts to not only build back better our supply chains as they recover from the pandemic, but advance projects that make the movement of goods even more efficient and resilient against future disruptions. And I'm mindful of our workforce needs. Building institutional capacity to ensure we're doing all we can as responsibly as we can to deliver transformative projects responsive to the needs of communities in a timely way is something I suspect all of us can relate to right now. The fact is, we need an energized and excited workforce to maximize the bipartisan infrastructure law investments and help deliver projects on budget and on time with quality. FRA's Office of Research, Development, and Technology is currently leading a railroad industry workforce development survey. That report will describe in detail the industry's top workforce challenges and opportunities. As stated earlier, FRA is committed to ensuring fairness and equity in all we do, including implementing these historic investments in infrastructure. We want to make sure that all stakeholders have the same opportunities. As I mentioned, FRA is conducting a minority and women-owned business enterprise disparity study. Some of you may have already been contacted about it. We're collecting information on railroad contracting, subcontracting, experiences to assess whether discrimination and other barriers to contracting opportunities exist. The smart, talented public servants at FRA stand ready and willing to help in the effort to restore and expand safe, reliable, efficient rail options now and into the future. We look forward to our continued partnership with the North Carolina Department of Transportation and the state to build on a long history of success. The state is a model and leader for surrounding states to have wide regional approach to how we approach this effort. That includes projects like the Long Bridge going between Virginia and Washington, D.C. It includes the Southeast Corridor Rail Commission. Take my word for it. This is such an exciting time and historic moment to be involved in rail. And I hope you share in that excitement. I know that your state DOT is ready. I hope you share my view that some of our careers have been poised for this moment. Now it's here. With the investments made possible by the bipartisan infrastructure law and a president and secretary who appreciate and know rail, I'm incredibly optimistic about what we can achieve. We need to do that together, not only at the state DOT level, not only at the business level, but also with our industry partners to make this future possible. Let's build back better. Thank you for your commitment to infrastructure, for including rail in this year's summit.
Thank you, Mr. Bose. We understand that you may have to leave a little early, so we're going to shift our order of things, and we're going to ask audience if they have any questions for Mr. Bose. But I've got one I'd like to sort of kick off with, and it's around that the new $66 billion of new money, I think I would call it, available for rail, and the listening sessions that you talked about for the public outreach. Sort of, what is the status of those? Have they been scheduled? Has that been pushed out to your stakeholders? And then along with that, has the eligibility for some of these competitive grants, has that been broadened some?
Thank you. In terms of the scheduling of the listening sessions, that's underway right now. We've let it be known that we're looking at the late January, February timeframe for the initial ones, and then subsequent sessions and discussions. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to wait to contact FRA. You should absolutely do that. We have a website on the bipartisan infrastructure law that explains and has fact sheets on our programs and the opportunities that are going to follow. In terms of the programs themselves, there's obviously statutory criteria, and then we're going to have the programs around that. One thing that we're really paying attention to, and it's not so much about a state like North Carolina, which in many ways has its has a robust pipeline of rail projects. We also want to make sure that non-traditional applicants this time around have an opportunity to compete. So it means getting some of those potential applicants technical assistance so that they know what we're expecting. And that includes entities like tribes. It includes local governments that may not have the capacity that a North Carolina DOT has. So we're being mindful of that. And we want those entities to succeed because we're taking this notion of equity not only at an individual basis, but at a regional and really across the board, economic basis across the country. So we're being mindful of that and deliberate. Now, another thing to keep in mind, we do have a pending round of that Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grant Program underway right now, and we're reviewing applications. We have an open application process for a multi-million-dollar federal-state partnership grant process right now, too. So I'd encourage those of you in the audience just to keep that in mind as well.
Thank you. And I took the liberty before the session of looking Mr. Bose up on the internet, and if you go to railroads.dot.gov, you will see Mr. Bose doing a great explanation of the bipartisan infrastructure funding and sort of the different buckets that the Federal Railroad Administration is going to be working within. One of the most exciting buckets, I thought, was this idea of, and I'm going to try to use the right nomenclature, corridor identification and development. That's where, presumably, and I'm going to ask Mr. Bose to sort of explain it further, you would use rail to connect two cities. I'm assuming relatively large population centers. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and what the vision is there?
Yeah, very good question. We've already gotten lots of interest in that program, and it's definitely a program that Congress had an eye to identify places where service doesn't exist or will be enhanced. And large population centers, I think, are one aspect of that. But I think it's also just about connecting communities along those corridors as well. And we really want to be mindful of places across the country and also just places within a state that may not have been served by rail in the past that may have good opportunities to be served by rail in the future. So we want to keep that in mind as well. And we know also in the corridor programs, some service, maybe we call it conventional rail, let's say 75 miles an hour under, 125 miles or under. And other places may think about high-speed rail. We want communities to make their own choices about the types of service that you all want and want to choose. And we want to provide the technical assistance to help those communities get there. And that corridor program is also going to be instrumental in that pipeline that I talked about establishing that. So it's going to be a real opportunity for us, and those are the types of types of pieces of the bill in the timing that may be able to go sooner versus later. because we definitely need that information to help us think about things at a national level. And I think this is a good point to just mention also that I mentioned the investment in North Carolina in particular over the past decade. The thing that really makes the bipartisan infrastructure law different this time around is we had an $8 billion infusion of rail funding in 2009 through the Recovery Act, and then a subsequent approximately $2 billion the year after that in 2010. But from 2010 to 2015, there was no rail program to speak of other than things like the Tiger program and some other discretionary programs, not at FRA. Then the FAST Act came along and authorized the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grant Program and the Fed-State partnership. But it wasn't to the level of the Recovery Act, and now we're back at that. And it's really, really important to keep in mind that some places, again, are not like North Carolina who've invested their own money, so there's definitely some catching up to do. But I guess the other side of it, and the other way to look at it, is North Carolina is definitely ahead of the game and actually can serve as a model, I think has served as a model to states like Virginia, who put together a very robust rail program on their own, and North Carolina and Virginia are going to connect to each other in a more robust way. But it can also be a model going south to places like South Carolina, Georgia, the rest of the Southeast. And so that's really important to keep in mind is we definitely we want to encourage and we want to recognize efforts in states like North Carolina that have already been put in.
Thank you, Mr. Bose. I think we ought to take a few minutes, and if there are any questions from the audience, give Mr. Bose a chance to respond. We'll bring a microphone to you, and I would encourage you not to be bashful. Any questions? All right, we have one back in the back, okay?
I know you're recently into the job, but I wondered what was your vision for FRA under your administration?
That's a really good question and one that I've thought about a lot. Because as Mr. Loyal mentioned, I have the good fortune of returning to the Federal Railroad Administration, to the U.S. Department of Transportation, a second chance, a second opportunity that not a lot of people get. And I definitely thought about if I had the opportunity to return, what would I want? One thing I always say to the FRA staff in particular is, I completely understand I'm not there permanently. I'm very much a visitor there in some respects. But obviously I have some outcomes and results that I have to deliver on for the President, for the Secretary, and the American people. I'm very conscious of the clock on things, and I know how fast it goes. I'm already done with a quarter of the 4 years, right? A year's already passed by, and we have a lot of work to do in front of us. So what does that mean? That means, for me, it starts with people. We have to have a robust capacity within FRA. That's the expectations that our partners have, and we want to meet that. And I know that the people there are going to be there after I leave, and that's a real legacy for me. And we had initiated hiring starting in January 20th when I walked in the door. We have to ramp that up. We have to be mindful that attrition happens and people move around within the department, within the Federal Railroad Administration, so you're not really gaining people. And we also know, if you look at the people who join FRA, we want that to be a range of people with a diverse background, with a diverse set of experiences, because I think that's going to strengthen FRA. So that's on the hiring front. But also we know that there has to be proper oversight and management over the $66 billion. The taxpayers, Congress, variety of oversight folks are expecting that. So we are going to have systems in place to manage that well. At the same time, we don't want FRA to be a barrier to projects getting underway, to projects getting completed, but we have to be mindful of doing things properly. So that's another aspect of things that I'm focused on, is that management and oversight. And also at FRA, safety continues to be our North Star. So I definitely have it in mind to move the trajectory and keep the trajectory of safety improvements on the right path. And again, hopefully at the end of my 4 years, look back on my time there and point to the successes that we've had. My first year, I felt was already productive. Between getting the Hudson River Tunnel environmental process complete and well on the way to construction and full funding, to ending the California high-speed rail litigation, so that project didn't have a dark cloud over it and could progress on its own. Those were two significant things, not to mention the American Jobs Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So it was a pretty good first year, I'd like to think, but I know we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us, and we can't rest.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bose. Your enthusiasm shows through. I feel like shows through in your presentation, and we're tickled to be your first official presentation as the administrator. I guess you'll remember us for that now, won't you? Okay,
Absolutely.
good. All right. So thank you, and let's give him another round of applause. Thank you. Yeah, take care. All right, we're going to move on, and I'll introduce our next presenter and panelist. Mr. John Dillard is the Director of State Relations at CSX. He oversees the company's state and local government relations in North Carolina and South Carolina. He's based out of Columbia. His duties include interacting with folks like us on the local government and state government sides, legislators, state agencies, enough, I'm sure, to keep you very busy. So we'll invite you up, and I think you got a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate that. It is wonderful to be here, and certainly thrilled to be here with Administrator Bose and to hear his remarks as well. And this is the first one of these I have done, believe it or not, post-pandemic. So it's nice to be in a room with faces, and particularly faces that are familiar to me. So I do have a few slides to run through, and then happy to take some questions. There we go. Okay, great. Yeah, so I just wanted to, sort of provide the perspective for freight rail today. Again, with certainly Administrator Bose touched on some freight issues as well, and certainly appreciate that. And Ray, it couldn't maybe somewhat delayed with our colleagues from Amtrak, but certainly just wanted to provide for you all the perspective on freight from CSX's perspective in North Carolina, and then talk a little bit about our CCX facility in Rocky Mount, which we are continue to be very excited about. Right here on the first slide, just a quick overview of CSX's overall network. We are an eastern U.S. railroad, east of the Mississippi, 23 states, over about 20,000 route miles, and we provide rail service in key markets. Some of those that you see listed there: energy, industrial, construction, agriculture, and consumer products. We serve over 70 ocean, river, and lake port terminals, including the Port of Wilmington here in North Carolina. And one keynote there at the bottom, just to give you an idea of the amount of investment that it takes to operate a Class 1 railroad, and CSX in particular. We have, in the past 6 years, invested $12 billion in the network, across the network. So it's a pretty important figure for us. And turning quickly to CSX in North Carolina, certainly a very important state for us. Not only is our A line, our main north-south corridor runs through the state of North Carolina, but we also have several other very important routes. We have over 500 employees here in the state, 1,700 miles of track. That does include some tracks in some of our yards and other things. So not all of that is mainline track, but nonetheless, it's a significant footprint. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to as well, Administrator Bose talked about at-grade crossings and crossing safety, and some federal money that has been, as part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, has been set aside to reduce the number of at-grade crossings and for grade separation projects. And just to give you a picture, CSX has just over 1,600 at-grade crossings in the state of North Carolina, to give you an idea. So we're just one railroad, as well as our colleagues at Norfolk Southern and the numerous short lines. But that's a lot of crossings. Takes a lot to maintain those crossings. We certainly always with an eye towards safety at those crossings for both pedestrians and the motoring public, and really have found a great working relationship and a partner with NCDOT and the rail division over the years, and with an eye towards grade crossing safety. It's something we think about, as I said, an awful lot, and have really found a wonderful partner in NCDOT around the state of North Carolina over the years, looking at things like traffic separation studies. What can we do to work together to try to not only reduce the number of at-grade crossings, but to reduce congestion, alleviate frustrations for both pedestrians and the motoring public, and also provide a safer environment for everyone. Also wanted to note, you see there our select sites. These are sites that our industrial development team, some of you may work closely with my colleague Kellen Riley, who handles our industrial development. It's our economic development arm of the company here in North Carolina. We have 2 select sites in North Carolina, one over in Edgecombe County, and then one in Brunswick County. And these are sites that Kellen and his team and others have done a lot of work with on the front end to try to make sure that those are development ready for rail-served projects. So looking at things in advance like water and sewer, utilities, electricity, etc. So when projects are looking for rail-served sites, those are some that we can show them and work closely with our the county and economic development partners, and also our state partners as well. And then also wanted to highlight our short line partners in the state of North Carolina. 13 short line railroads. For those of you who may not be that familiar with a short line railroad, they are very oftentimes the first mile, last mile connection to very important industries in your state and across the country. We see really our short line partners as an extension of our network, and being able to serve areas of the country and in a state like North Carolina where we don't serve directly, but where we may have a connection to a short line railroad and be able to provide service in that form. And there's a really strong short line industry in North Carolina. Some great partners. They are engaged. I think you will, in your communities, if you are lucky enough to have a short line in your community, I think you will find that to be the case. They are engaged and always willing to partner. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk just about intermodal and as we move towards CCX, talk about intermodal in a broad sense of what intermodal is. And I think most of you are probably pretty savvy when it comes to freight and logistics intermodal, else you wouldn't be at this event or in this breakout session. But just to give you an idea, there's a basic definition of what intermodal is. It's using two forms of or multiple modes of transportation, particularly over a long haul distance. And at CSX, you'll hear us talk about international intermodal and domestic intermodal. And there's a breakdown really of the difference between those two. And as you can see, the big difference on the international front is that first step, the ocean transit. So when we talk about international movement, we're talking about boxes that come in off of a ship from the ocean and then move their way through the supply chain to a port, then a rail haul to a rail terminal, and then finally to that distribution center or the ultimate destination. And then on the domestic side, as you can see, it's pretty much the same movement. It just does not involve that ocean carrier, and it's moving from sort of point A to point B in a manner that is makes sense to use our intermodal product. This next slide, just briefly our intermodal network at a glance, and you can see that we talk about the core triangle at CSX. That's our network there. What you see on the right side of the screen, that triangle is it's kind of the core part of our network. So the Northeast to the Midwest, down to Florida through the Southeast, back up through the Mid-Atlantic through the to the Northeast, and you see CCX is featured there. And again, when you think about the intermodal product, you know, a lot of those ports on the East Coast, a lot of those goods want to get inland to these big population centers, these consumptive markets. Certainly in a place like the Northeast, if a customer is using the port of New York, New Jersey, a lot of that freight stays within that region. But for a lot of the other ports on the East Coast, and Wilmington is certainly an example of that, there's certain things I'm sure that come into the port of Wilmington that will stay in the Wilmington area, that will stay in North Carolina. But some of it wants to get to the larger population and consumptive markets in the U.S., and that's what our intermodal network is set up to do and provide that service, and CCX, we think, is a great addition to that. Wanted to point out as well that that we do have our intermodal dedicated website. Is just very simple. It's intermodal.com if you'd like to learn more about intermodal in general or CSX's intermodal service as well. I noticed today that I failed to put a title on this slide, so that's, as I said, it's been a while since I've done one of these. But really, what this shows you is part of the reason that we chose Rocky Mount and part of the reason that we chose North Carolina. So when we started looking way back, some years ago, to create a new intermodal terminal in the Southeast, considered a number of states, number of sites, but the reason North Carolina made sense to us, and I'll speak about this a little more later, but it's again, it's access to a population center here in the Triangle, but also the connectivity through our core network and through the intermodal network, that we could be a part of that supply chain, a key part of that supply chain to move those goods where they want to be and move those goods via rail in a way that makes sense from an environment standpoint, from a congestion standpoint, and still offer efficient service for our customers. Okay, so why Rocky Mount? We talked about North Carolina, and it's the fast-growing population in North Carolina is something that you all would are very familiar with, and with that population growth, that population they're going to consume goods and use products, and so that's one reason why North Carolina made a lot of sense to us. Another reason that Rocky Mount made a lot of sense to us. Ultimately, I'm sure you all know that wasn't the first site, but it's a site where we ended up, and it was ultimately the best site for the terminal. But it's really well positioned. It's very close, relatively in logistics terminology, very close to the growing Triangle region. Great access to I-95, and thanks to our, again, it was a great partnership all around with NCDOT, but thanks to the Highway Division, we made some improvements in and around the terminal there in Rocky Mount to get back out to I-95, but frankly, we didn't really have to do a whole lot because the highway infrastructure was there. We had the first time we went to the site, I mean, it's pretty much a straight shot from I-95 over to the terminal. And there on the left, excuse me, you will see that's where the terminal is itself. And so you can see it's, in addition to 95, it's adjacent to 301. So some of that more local traffic that comes into CCX on a train that's looking to either get north or south within the region, 301 is certainly an option, but then also a quick straight shot to I-95. Those are the actual cranes that you see there. That's a picture from CCX. So we're very excited about to finally have those cranes in the air, and I'll talk a little more about those here shortly. But again, I want to just another nod to our colleagues in the room at NCDOT. And the legislature, and really the governor's office and everybody that really helped with this project. It was not an easy one to get finished. stopped and started a couple of times, but we're really pleased with the way that it ended up, and pleased to be in Rocky Mount. The environment, as you heard, Administrator Bose touched on it as well. The rail environment in North Carolina was really a key aspect of that. We didn't have to educate people here on why rail was important, on what this could mean potentially to the economy in the region and the state. It was well understood. And again, we think about talking about the federal funding that is now available. If you look at the STI program, here in North Carolina and the investments that that program allows for freight rail in particular, there's no question that it would have been a much harder lift for CCX had STI not existed. And then last but not least, it's just still we think there's a great advantage to this terminal being where it is. We currently today initially have service from CCX to the Midwest. And again, so that's about getting the goods that are coming in on the East Coast to the big consumptive markets in the Midwest, Chicago, etc. We think it's a wonderful solution to be part of a supply chain solution. It's just another option that not only for existing businesses, but as businesses look to locate within the region, that this could be something that would really be advantageous to them. And one thing I wanted to mention as well is we're very appreciative of the support we've received in Rocky Mount from the Twin Counties, from Nash County, from Edgecombe County, the Carolinas Gateway Partnership, Norris Tolson and Hoppy Jordan for their leadership and their support. It's going to mean a lot to that area for sure, but we think it's going to mean a lot to that region as a whole, and the state of North Carolina as a whole as well. It's going to open up some opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, as companies and manufacturers are looking to locate in eastern North Carolina. We think CCX is a great selling tool to be a part of that. And just a little more about the terminal operations. Opened in 2021. We've been very pleased with the initial volumes through there. It is a very technologically advanced terminal. We have 3 wide-span cranes. They are electric. They are zero-emission cranes. They are relatively quiet for the work that they do. We also have what we call our X-Gate technology, which is how we coordinate with the truck driver. So as truck drivers come in and out of the facility to pick up those boxes that have come into the facility on a train and then been lifted off that train by the cranes, the truck drivers are using mobile apps to know exactly where that box is. So to create a really seamless, congestion-free environment out there, so that we don't have trucks, backing up on the terminal, at the gate, or out onto the local road network. We want that to be as seamless and as safe as possible and as efficient as possible. So we're excited about what's to come for CCX, for the region, but also just, and I'll say this before concluding, is that just in general, I think we've had a wonderful partnership with NCDOT in the state of North Carolina for a long time. CCX is the latest example of that, but several years ago, we made some expansions to our intermodal facility in Charlotte with the great help and support of NCDOT. Administrator Bose mentioned the ongoing projects between Wilmington and Charlotte, which we think are critical to that corridor, and really just appreciate that partnership. And then certainly we have regular ongoing conversations with the state about their passenger views and goals and how we fit into that, how we can work together to hopefully help accomplish those as well. So with that, I will sit down and just thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Dillard. We'll have a chance now, I think, to if Mr. Dillard is willing to ask him some questions on his presentation. A question that I had that occurred to me as we talked a lot with the Administrator Bose about the bipartisan infrastructure bill and what all's in that. So what's the CSX take on that? And I know you guys will be very interested in some of the safety funding. What are the other opportunities that you see?
Well, I think as Administrator Bose mentioned, the grant opportunities for freight rail and for port projects. those competitive programs of more opportunities for those types of projects to find some funding that maybe, whereas without the bill, there maybe wouldn't be those funding opportunities. So I think we're coming at it from a couple of ways. Is number one, internally, are there projects, CSX, sponsored projects that we're giving some thought to that may fit into these programs, and how do we work with, the states and localities where those projects are, to see if that, if our goals align with our public partners and their goals. And then at the same time, I think we're probably going to be approached by some of those public partners on projects that are important to them, that have a CSX component to it. So we're going to spend a lot of time and talking with our partners in the public sector. But yeah, I mean, it cannot be understated from our perspective, the money that will be available for at-grade crossing safety and for grade separations, the continued safety improvements that comes with that, but also just the congestion relief. I mean, every one of us in this room, me included, I'm sure, has been stopped by a train at some point at a crossing. It's frustrating, but there are comprehensive solutions that can be accomplished that can alleviate that congestion, make things safer all around, and create a really efficient rail network. And so that, to us, is really exciting.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience from Mr. Dillard? I have another question. This is really just kind of curious.
Sure.
If you guys were at the, and I don't know if you were, Mr. Dillard, at the general session this morning, we saw a lot about innovation in the technology space, and particularly, sort of how it might transform transportation over the next couple decades. Is there any new technology out there on the freight rail side that you'd like to preview for the group?
Well, no, I think there is. I mean, again, you think about, safety for us is always top of mind. So the way that we operate our trains, the way that we inspect our tracks, the way we inspect our bridges, just as an example, we're using drones, whereas, 5-10 years ago, if we wanted to inspect a bridge, you may have to have someone go out there and actually put eyes on them. Now we're using drones for some of that, particularly. We just had a winter storm here come through as we're looking at impacts to our network, fallen trees, et cetera. So those types of things we're always looking at. Certainly, fuel efficiency, power for locomotives. I think that there's endless opportunities out there in that technology space, something we're giving a lot of thought to and having a lot of discussions with our employees and colleagues as well.
We've all heard a lot about supply chain issues throughout the country. I think a lot of it's been within the trucking industry. So can you talk to us a little bit about what your experience has been opening CCX in the middle of a pandemic and supply chain disruptions, and then sort of the state of play with regard to supply chain on the CSX side?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's the workforce and making sure that our workforce is right sized continues to be a challenge. We are hiring probably at a faster rate than we have hired in a long time, to get to make sure we've got employees to run those trains. The demand is very high from our customers, from the ports and others, as has been well documented. But we've got to have bodies to run those trains. And those jobs, as opposed to if you look at a facility like CCX, because of the technological advances there, we're moving those cranes. They're being operated actually from an office. It's pretty interesting to see. It's almost like somebody sitting in front of a video game console with a joystick. Those are nice jobs. The railroad jobs are nice jobs too, but they're outdoors and they're 12 hours shift, and they're 24-hour a day, 365. So it's a tough environment, and it's not for everyone. So a lot of time, attrition is an issue for us. We're continuing to work towards, I think, as I said before, a workforce that is nimble and efficient, but also available. And certainly the pandemic has been a challenge, there as well. This latest wave of Omicron has really had an impact on us and our employees. Making sure people are safe, that they are, quarantined when they need to quarantine. But we've got 2 people in a cab of a locomotive. social distancing there is a challenge. Certainly they are, wearing masks and all of that, but still it does have an impact on the workforce and trying to make sure that there are people available to fill those jobs when they're there. So if you know anybody that's interested, CSX.com, we're hiring.
That's great. All right. One more chance at a question for Mr. Dillard. Okay, we've got a couple popping up here, okay? Aaron, I saw them first.
Just a quick question. CSX, can I say passenger rail
Yes.
in this room?
Yes.
I'm interested in CSX's attitude about passenger rail. We've seen a lot of developments in Virginia, and I'm kind of curious about the dynamic with that.
Sure. Well, listen, I think this is a great room to mention passenger rail because we've got a great partner at NCDOT that has always approached those discussions rationally and from our standpoint, very reasonably. We are not opposed to passenger rail by any stretch. We do want to make sure that if it's on a CSX-owned corridor, that it's not going to impact the safety of the operation, that there's going to be enough capacity to operate not only current freight service but future freight service in a way that makes sense for everybody. So I think those discussions, I think they've been successful in places like North Carolina because they've come to us early and often and tried to and have an understanding of our position and where we come from and the interest that we are bound to protect, which is our franchise and our network and our capacity. Without the capacity and the ability to operate trains, we don't have anything. So that's important to us, but it's just about, I think, having those conversations, sometimes very tough conversations about, what everyone's needs are, and then seeing if we can come to some common ground. But I certainly think, as you've seen in Virginia and other places, where it makes sense and where there's a deal to be done, that we're willing to come to the table and negotiate those in good faith.
Fair enough. Now, I think there was one more question, sort of quickly. We'll try to grab, because we still have one more presentation, and we are.
Just a quick question for you. Oops, sorry about that. As CSX looks to the future, is there any partnerships that you're looking with as far as battery-powered locomotives go? I know, like the most recent, Evolution series locomotives from General Electric is kind of as new and fangled as it gets. But as we look to the future, battery-powered locomotives or hydrogen-powered, what's CSX looking at?
Yeah, and I will say I'm not the most competent subject matter expert on that, but the answer is yes. I mean, I know we are looking at all manner of that type of technology and power to see what makes sense. I mean, I think for us, too, it's just making sure that think about us operating in the Mid-Atlantic area in these mountainous, hilly, areas where it takes a lot of power to pull a 7,000-foot, train, just to make sure that everything works the way it should. But I definitely think that's something that we're open to and looking at. I think we have to. So just to see if it makes sense moving forward and what it might look like.
Good question. Well, thank you, Mr. Dillard, for being here. And you guys see on the screen his email. If you got any questions, I'm sure he'd be happy to respond to those. So I'm going to introduce our next presenter. And you're welcome to stay up if you'd like. And that's Mr. RALEIGH from Amtrak. Are you in the room? Oh, okay. Yeah. Come on up. Yeah. Mr. Lang is the Vice President of State-Supported Services line at Amtrak. He oversees the contractual relationship with Amtrak's 20 state partners, whose trains account for about 49% of Amtrak's ridership. Let's give Mr. Lang a warm welcome. Thank you. Now, do you have a slide deck?
That's it.
Okay. Yeah, and there's cool.
Okay. Great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate that. I appreciate the welcome, and I appreciate the invitation to speak to you all here. The light's really bright, so I don't know if there's any friends in the room. So if I don't smile at you, that's just because I can't see you. But thanks. I apologize that I walked in a few minutes late, and I knew this was going to happen when I was invited to speak to you all back in the early part of the fall. And I looked at the calendar, and I saw that Amtrak's board meeting was scheduled for today, and generally I report out to the board, and as luck would have it, on Friday afternoon they gave me the schedule for when I would report to the board, and of course it was now, so I had to do that presentation a few minutes ago. It went well, but some of my deck, you probably, if you saw Mr. Bose speak, some of this might be a little bit repetitive, but I wanted to walk you through some of the really amazing things that are happening at Amtrak and what I think they're really going to mean for North Carolina and the southeastern United States, because there's really, Jason and Julie have an amazing program here. It is really a showpiece program. It's really one of the country's best intercity passenger rail programs. We're very proud to partner with them, and I think the infrastructure bill, which everybody's talking about now, is going to serve them well. I mean, I think North Carolina's poised to do great things as a result of the funding that's going to become available to the DOT, and we certainly want to be a big part of supporting and advancing that. The second great passenger rail revolution begins. You all know that this passed on November 15th, and significantly, the IIJ included a huge infusion of federal capital for this mode, intercity passenger rail, that will come over the next 5 years, and really had some policy changes that are coming with it too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I was at an event 2 weeks ago, believe it or not, in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, talking about service to Scranton with a member of Congress, and behind me on a screen like that, they said $66 billion coming to Amtrak. That's not the truth. That's not the case. And I thought, he's a member of Congress and he voted for the bill. But it is, there is $66 billion coming for intercity passenger rail. And certainly the corporation is going to do very, very well there. But this is really the way that the bill is structured, and I'll talk about this, is it's really structured in many respects to help states grow corridor services like you have here in North Carolina. And I'm going to get into this now. Sort of what you see here, it's $22 billion to Amtrak, $36 billion to the FRA, much of which flows to Amtrak in the states, and then some rail safety programs that we'll talk about. If you've seen me speak before, and maybe some of you have since the fall, I mean, this is the slide which I think tells the story the best. On the left-hand side, you see these two boxes which represent money going to Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. On the right-hand side, you see boxes representing money, funding which comes to the Amtrak National Network. And I'll talk about these a little bit. You see that some of these boxes in the middle are two safety programs, one around grade crossing improvements and one around the Chrissy Grant program. The boxes surrounded in green are boxes which are funds which go to the FRA. And the boxes surrounded, I think it's blue, maybe it's purple, are dollars that go directly to Amtrak. Generally, I have 27 years at Amtrak, and whenever there's been an infusion of capital to come to Amtrak, usually these boxes on the left are where it comes. It's generally historically gone to the Northeast Corridor. It's an asset that we have, and the capital generally follows the asset. What's unique about this bill is the size of these boxes. On the right-hand side, for funding which goes to the national network, that's generally not how, whenever we've had an infusion in capital, that's not how the money has come. And it's really significant, and that's why I'm so optimistic about what can happen here in North Carolina and in the southeastern United States. The Northeast Corridor money, $6 billion comes to us, a little over $1 billion a year, and then $24 billion to the FRA, who then spend it invested on the Northeast Corridor, in line with the 2035 plan that the states in the Northeast have agreed to. Over on the right-hand side, and this is important, there's $16 billion which goes to the national network, and specifically the direction in the legislative language is that we have to use it to address the backlog of state of good repair for infrastructure that we own and assets that we own at Amtrak. So we will begin using this funding for a new rolling stock. We're talking to our partners in North Carolina about this now for all new updated rolling stock, long distance rolling stock, new locomotives, stations, improvements at stations to bring them into compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, upgrading our computer and reservation systems, updating our back shops, some of the big facilities we own like Chicago Union Station, the line we own in Michigan, places like that. $16 billion is going to go for that. And it was really specifically around addressing the backlog of state of good repair. It was not for new services. But you'll see this box in the bottom right, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. It's $12 billion over 5 years, and it's this new program, the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail. And I think this is where all of us in this mode are going to be interacting with each other over the next 5 years. That program is really about developing new short-distance corridors around the country, upgrading existing corridors, increasing frequencies on existing corridors like you have here in North Carolina over the next 5 years. And the hope is that this becomes a permanent program. This is a program. The Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail is now an official program, that we hope will be reauthorized in the next reauthorization to do what we refer to as state-supported corridors around the country. Go to the next slide here. So what are state-supported corridors? So this is an interesting subject, and I find that as I speak publicly, a lot of people don't sort of understand how we're structured and the law that governs us. The law which passed in 2008, PREA, was a game-changing law, and it said, in fact, that any short-distance train in the Amtrak system off the Northeast Corridor, any short-distance train had to be funded by a state or it would go away. In other words, we could not use our federal appropriation to start or operate short-distance trains. They had to be funded by a state or really a non-Amtrak entity. And there were lots of services that we ran at that time that were impacted by this change of law. What happened was the states stepped forward and picked them up and began funding them. North Carolina is one of our biggest and best state partners, absolutely, and oldest state partners, too, with a very aggressive rail program. Importantly, in 2019, the company set an all-time ridership record. We carried more than 32 million passengers. I run that state-supported service line. In 2019, 50% of Amtrak's passengers run a state-funded train. So half of our client base, half of our passengers and customers ride a state-supported train. It's the fastest-growing part of the company, and it's where our growth plan is really structured. If we want to have service to Las Vegas and Phoenix and Nashville and Louisville, places that we don't serve, we're going to have to do it in partnership with the state government around the country. And the IIJA, with that $12 billion program, put capital, real dollars on the table for states to work with us and work with the host railroads, the freight railroads like CSX, who was just here, to make significant capital improvements, capacity investments in those railroads to start new services. This is what the Amtrak system looks like. The yellow trains are the long-distance trains. Believe it or not, there's only 15 long-distance trains left in the United States. Most of the trains we run are either on the Northeast Corridor or are the state-supported services. The lines in blue are those state services that in total we have 19 partners, 17 states. California has 3 partners inside the state that we work with. But that's what the map really looks like today, and that's where our state services are. You can see, again, large parts of the country are unserved. This map is deceptive in that it looks like we have lots of service in Dallas and Florida. That's not true. We don't, and that's a problem. I mean, we'd really like to be in some of these big markets. 1 train a day to Atlanta is really unacceptable. We really do. If we want to grow, it's going to have to be in partnership with the state. The IIJA was really a reauthorization bill. It was the reauthorization of the surface bill. And we went into reauthorization. We started planning work on reauthorization a couple of years before this passed. And we had thought, and we had said, look, the business model is strange. It's unique. If we want to grow, and if we want to grow into these markets that I just mentioned, we're going to have to do it in partnership with the state. States have a hard time doing a lot of this stuff because the price of admission for new services now is very expensive. The infrastructure improvements that have to be made on the Class 1 freight roads to accommodate faster moving passenger trains are expensive, and states really don't have the ability to do it on their own. So we got pretty aggressive and we said, hey, we want to grow into these markets. We can't afford not to. If you're not growing, you're dying. As our CEO says, you have to grow. So we thought, well, really what we need to do is have the Congress create a program that gives federal capital to our state partners so that they can be in a position to grow. And in many respects, we succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. It certainly helped to have a guy named Amtrak Joe, in the White House. But we put together a pretty aggressive plan called the Amtrak Connects Us, showing if we got billions and billions of dollars worth of federal capital, what could a network look like? The map there is probably not too easy to read, but that was the vision we put together for short distance corridors around the country that we wanted to grow into. This was this is a blow up of what our vision was in the southeastern United States. You can see we had a pretty aggressive plan for growth in service in the southeast, here in North Carolina, in South Carolina, in Georgia, Tennessee. Again, we have almost no service in Tennessee, limited service in Georgia, limited service in Florida. We had a very aggressive growth plan in the southeast. Happily, the states in the southeast have all responded extremely well to this. We've had wonderful conversations since the bill passed with most of the states who have expressed, their interest in growing service, finally, as a result of the capital infusion which is available to them. The Southeast High-Speed Rail Commission, which Julie chairs. Is Julie still in the room? She just stepped out. Which Julie chairs, is I think going to be a wonderful partner for us to work on to grow these services and develop these services, and we're excited about that. I know I'm short on time, so I'm just going to walk you through a couple of slides that lay out the specifics of the programs and the processes. But there's really 3 new programs created in the IIJA, plus the policy one, which is around the corridor identification and selection program. I'll briefly talk about that. But the federal-state partnership for intercity passenger rail grants, that's the big one. That's where growth is going to occur. Restoration enhancement grants, those are operating dollars, which are going to be available to states, not just capital this time, but there's going to be operating support available to states to restore or enhance their services. And Congress also created the Interstate Rail Compacts Grant Program to allow states to form commissions like the Southeast High-Speed Rail Commission and have funding to manage and staff those commissions. And then, of course, this does not mean we're not going to continue to get our annual appropriation. It was clear from Congress that they're going to continue to fund us in a robust way during the life of the IIJA. And this is sort of a timeline of how it plays out. And I want to just real quickly focus on this. We are the green line is sort of ground zero. The first 6 months, the period of time we're in now, the staff at USDOT and FRA are creating the program. So nothing is really happening right now. May 14th of 2022, they unveil the program. And then the 12 months between May of this year and May of next year is when states begin to submit their applications and their proposals for new services to the states. And then next May, in May of 2023, the FRA will publish its map of where they want services to go to. I hope it will look a lot like the Amtrak Connects Us map, but I think it's going to be based a lot on the applications that states like North Carolina submit. The R&E grants for operating come then at the same time. The Intercity Rail Compact program that I just talked about, that is being worked on now and will become available soon to the states to apply for. And of course, we will continue to get a network grant. It looks like we'll be able to put as much as 10% of our network grant up for matching dollars to our state partners, which we're excited about. If we get $2 billion a year, that'd be about $200 million. Lastly, this is probably a little bit of overkill here. The FRA program, this is what it's going to look like. They're going to create the program first. They're going to select, states are going to submit to them corridors that they want to have developed. The FRA is going to look at them all, select which ones they think are good. I have a feeling they'll say all of them are good. Publish a map, and then we'll all work together on service development plans, the plan to implement them, if you will. And then the FRA is going to submit that report to the Congress. So that's what it's going to look like. I want to, again, stress, that was the last slide, how important that $12 billion, right there at the bottom right is. That's really, that was really the big, in my mind, the big development in the IIJA. There's $12 billion available now for new routes and services. I'm excited about all of it and the opportunities that are going to come with new equipment, state of good repair issues, but that $12 billion in that box is really where we're going to live and work with each other to develop new services. I couldn't be more excited to have partners like North Carolina DOT leading the charge here. They have a phenomenal program. The S-Line project, which I'm sure you've all heard about, is really, there's not another program quite like it in the country. We provided matching capital to the state for their grants. If and when that S-Line is up and running, they'll have a publicly owned right-of-way from Washington, D.C. all the way down here to Raleigh, linking the Northeast Corridor, which is a publicly owned right-of-way too. So essentially from Boston, Massachusetts down here to Raleigh, there'll be a publicly owned corridor in the United States. And the opportunities that would create for all of us to develop this mode of transportation are really kind of mind-blowing. They really are. And this is the program that's going to make it all work. So that's what I wanted to say. Covered a lot of ground there. Happy to take any questions. I think I'm kind of late on time. But again, this is a really exciting time at Amtrak. We kind of refer to this as our Camelot moment. And but we're up to the task, and I'm excited about it.
I'll ask again, is there any questions for Mr. Lang? Yeah, we do have one in the back.
Am I live? Yeah. This is a question as an Amtrak passenger, so apologies to the rail professionals in the room, but it kind of it may be a big picture question, but when you see what's happening in Europe with the short haul airlines switching to rail for those kinds of trips, and the private sector getting into rail in places like Florida with Brightline, whenever I ride past Charlotte Douglas on the Amtrak line that is a stone's throw away, I wonder, why couldn't we connect there? So maybe there's a lot to that, but love your perspective.
Should be.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, yeah, you're good.
All right, good. Okay, yeah, the light went out. Yeah, a couple of things I'll say about that. First of all, in terms of Brightline, we don't see, I get asked this question all the time, and we don't really see Brightline as a competitor or as a threat. And I think oftentimes when I'm asked about Brightline, it's done sometimes with that as sort of the spirit of the question. What do you think about them? We take the approach that a rising tide raises all boats. And if there's private money that's coming into this mode of transportation, that is only a great thing. It can only be a great thing. That's what we wanted to see happen for years and years and years. And I think, what we really want is just a level playing field. Make sure that we have shared facilities, shared, use facilities. I live in Chicago. 100 years ago, the city had 6 train stations downtown. That doesn't work. We want to share train stations so that the mode can do well and be useful for the passenger base. And again, I think that their success is everybody in this mode's success. It really is. In terms of what's going on in Europe, yeah, I think what you're referring to oftentimes now is the sort of shaming which is going on over there about people flying short distances, and basically saying no, that we want to move everything over to rail or as much short distance travel over to rail as possible. I think that's a wonderful development. I mean, the board meeting I was just sitting through, we were talking about the company's climate commitment. It's a really important aspect of what we're doing. When I walked in, somebody was asking about electric locomotives. We're definitely the battery-powered locomotives. We're moving in that direction too, with some of the equipment we'll be procuring. One of the unique advantages that we have is we've sort of always been green. I mean, we're not sort of, we have to pivot to become green. We always haven't. The Northeast Corridor was electrified, a century ago. That's a great thing. So we have certain built-in advantages already, and I think are well positioned, to meet the changing needs of the traveling public.
Great, thank you. Time for one more question before we wrap up. Anybody? Okay, yeah, we have someone here.
got sound. See CSX and Amtrak sitting next to each other. I'd like to just hear your comments on how we rationalize capacity on rail lines as we develop them for passenger rail. CSX, like the other freight railroads, own the railroad, and they're in the business of moving freight trains. And the capacity optimization, rationalization discussion for now and for future build out is really an important one to facilitate both your strategies.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I mean, yeah, I think I want to go back to something I just said about our plan for reauthorization. I mean, we knew that if we wanted to develop short distance corridors in the United States, whether it's here or whether it's in the Front Range in Colorado, we don't own the infrastructure, and the way we're going to grow is in partnership with the owner of the railroad and a state. States don't really currently, most of them don't have the ability to make the kind of investments that are needed to build the capacity that the railroads need to make sure that the passenger trains, run on time and with priority and preference. And so our strategy was to pursue billions, literally billions, in capital to be made available to states so states could make the investments that the railroads need to accommodate those trains. And so, I mean, that was our strategy. I think, we don't want tense relationships with the railroads. There's nothing to be gained by that. There are sometimes points of tension, but that's, the strategy or the approach has always been to give states capital to make the investments in CSX and the other railroads that are necessary to accommodate the passenger train. I think, I think we've made a lot of headway with the railroads over the years. We have some very successful services around the country, and I think that the model is there. We want to work with them.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. I think it's, the funding helps. And I think you look at a state like North Carolina that this isn't our railroad, but the NCRR, NS, line between Charlotte and Raleigh, that was a, little bit at a time, year over year over year. And I think that from just my perspective, for instance, living in South Carolina, I think people sometimes expect that investment or those projects are going to happen overnight without understanding that, sometimes a project to straighten a curve and close a couple of crossings may not seem that significant when it's being constructed, but in the long run makes a big difference. So I think those types of projects and those types of investment and having a state partner that really understands that is critical. But also, I think it's just the continued discussion and conversation around capacity and priorities and what the public sector sees, what Amtrak or other commuter agencies see as priorities, and how that fits into the specific freight network that that's being looked at.
Great, thanks, guys. If we can get the poll question up on the screen, is it part of this deck? If we just click ahead, do that real quick. Yeah, okay. There's the results. I cannot read them from here. We'll leave them up as we adjourn today. Now, one theme I heard loud and clear from all three of the presenters was what a great partner NCDOT is and how fortunate we are in North Carolina to have such a strong rail network and rail leadership. And that's not by accident. Julie White, our Deputy Secretary, I don't know if she's still in the room, and Jason Orthner, our Director of Rail. So they'll be hanging around if you want to introduce yourself to them, but they're great leaders for rail. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and hope you have a good conference. Thanks.